The first thing I remember about that afternoon is the laughter. Not the kind that fills a room with warmth. Not the kind that invites you in. The kind that sits in the air like smoke after a fire. The kind that clings to your clothes and follows you home and finds you 3 in the morning when you can't sleep. That specific, polished, practiced laughter of people who have decided, long before you ever opened your mouth, exactly what you are worth. I was standing in the middle of my sister-in-law Renata's living room. Cream linen furniture, a vase of white orchids that cost more than my first paycheck, an entire wall of framed photographs documenting a family that had learned to perform happiness for cameras. And I was holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't asked for, wearing the dress I'd bought on sale 3 weeks earlier because I wanted to look presentable. Because I still believed, at that point, that presenting well mattered to these people. That trying mattered to these people. I had just told them about the house. Small place, I'd said. Rural. Needs some work. About 40 minutes outside the city, past the ridge, where the road turns to gravel for the last 2 kilometers. I told them I'd closed on it that morning. That I was excited. That it felt like mine in a way nothing had felt in a very long time. Renata had pressed her lips together in that particular way she had, the way that meant she was deciding how much condescension to dispense. And then she'd looked at her husband, Marcus, my husband Daniel's older brother. And Marcus had made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Something between a sigh and a chuckle, a dismissal compressed into a single exhalation. A gravel road, Renata said finally. How rustic. And then the laughter. Soft at first, almost polite, but growing the way a small fire grows when you stop paying attention to it. Daniel laughed too. That's the part I've never fully been able to organize inside myself. That he laughed. Not cruelly, he would tell me later, not meaning anything by it, just laughing because everyone else was laughing, because it's uncomfortable to be the only person in a room not laughing. As if discomfort were the worst thing that could happen to a person. As if the woman standing at the center of that laughter, the woman who was his wife, didn't count as a reason to stop. I set my glass of sparkling water down on the side table. I smiled. I said nothing. I had learned by then to say nothing. It was a skill I had developed over 7 years of marriage into that family. Honed the way you hone anything through repeated, patient, sometimes humiliating practice. I had learned to compress everything. The anger, the exhaustion, the deep, grinding awareness that I was always the outsider in that house. Always the woman who had come from nowhere important and married up and should be grateful. Into something small and smooth and inert. A stone I kept in my chest where it couldn't do any damage. That day, though, something shifted. Standing there in Renata's cream linen living room, listening to people laugh at the one good decision I had made entirely for myself, with my own money. Without asking anyone's permission or opinion or blessing, I felt the stone in my chest begin to change. Not dissolve. Sharpen. I want to tell you the whole story, because the house is not where it starts. The house is where I start. But the story goes back further than that. Back through years of accumulated small humiliations and patient invisibility. Back through the professional world, where I had been building something these people had never bothered to look at, because they had decided from the beginning what I was, and that decision made looking unnecessary. I want you to understand all of it, because what happened later, what I allowed to happen, what I made happen, doesn't make sense unless you understand what came before. So let's go back. My name is Clara. I grew up in a town with 4,000 people, a grain elevator, 1 stoplight, and a very good library, which was where I spent most of my adolescence because the library was quiet and warm, and nobody there had any particular opinions about who my family was or wasn't. My father drove trucks. My mother did bookkeeping for 3 small businesses in town, and she was meticulous about it, careful and precise in a way I didn't fully appreciate until I got older and understood what it meant to build something out of attention to detail. We were not poor. We were not comfortable. We were the specific category of working class that is invisible to people above it and invisible to people below it. Just present, just managing, just there. I was good at math in the way that surprises people who expect it to look a certain way. I was quiet and I wore glasses and I came from a town nobody had heard of. And I got a full scholarship to study finance at a university 2 states away. And I worked harder than I had ever worked in my life. And when I graduated, I had 2 job offers. And I took the one that paid slightly less because the firm had a better reputation. And I understood already that reputation compounds. I met Daniel at a colleague's birthday party in my 2nd year working. He was charming in the immediate, effortless way of people who have grown up expecting rooms to accommodate them. He had the kind of confidence that reads as warmth until you've known it long enough to understand the difference. He laughed at my jokes. He asked follow-up questions. He called when he said he would call. His family had money. Not extraordinary money, not dynastic wealth, but the accumulated, comfortable, well-managed money of 2 generations of professional success. Real estate held since the 70s, a family name that opened certain doors in the city. His mother, Elaine, had that particular quality of women who have been beautiful and known it and built their entire sense of order around it. And now that the beauty was aging, she was building it around something else, around correctness, around the maintenance of standards. His brother Marcus had taken over the family's property management business. Renata had grown up 2 neighborhoods over from Daniel, had gone to the right schools, had the right accent, had calibrated herself from birth to occupy exactly the position she now occupied. And then there was me. I want to be fair. Nobody was overtly cruel in those early years. Nobody said anything you could point to directly and say, "There, that is the wound. That is the thing that was done." It was subtler than that. It was the way Elaine would address questions about my professional opinions to Daniel, as though he might have a more reliable read on financial matters than I did, despite the fact that finance was my entire professional existence, and Daniel was a marketing manager. It was the way Renata would mention, in company, that the 2 of them had been looking at properties in certain neighborhoods. The implication being that these neighborhoods were aspirational in a way that required a certain kind of background to aspire to. It was the way nobody ever asked about my work in any concrete way, only in the social, gestural way that means they expect an answer they don't need to remember. It was the way Daniel let all of this happen. He wasn't cruel about it. He was absent about it. There is a specific quality of absence in a person who is present in a room, who is sitting across the table from you at dinner, who is sleeping beside you at night, but has made a decision somewhere deep and foundational that certain things are not his responsibility to notice. Daniel had made that decision about me, about the discomfort I carried, about the ways his family failed to see me. It wasn't malice. It was the smooth, practiced ease of a man who has never had to choose between his family's comfort and the dignity of the woman he married. Because everyone around him had quietly arranged things so that that choice never visibly presented itself. I kept working. That's the thing about being invisible. It leaves you a great deal of uninterrupted time. By year 4 of our marriage, I had moved from a junior analyst to senior associate at the firm. By year 6, I had been recruited to a boutique investment advisory practice that specialized in commercial real estate valuations, which turned out to be, whether by accident or some deep instinct I hadn't consciously recognized, exactly the right place for me. I understood property the way I had always understood numbers. Not as static facts, but as dynamic systems, as relationships between variables that most people treated as fixed, because fixing them was cognitively easier. I understood how blocks changed, how neighborhoods shifted, how the value embedded in a piece of land could be radically different from the value everyone agreed was embedded in it, and how that gap between actual value and perceived value was where real money lived. I was making good money, not by any means I advertised. My salary and bonuses were mine. The household expenses were split with Daniel. What remained, I invested quietly and consistently in the way my mother had taught me to keep books, meticulously without drama, with an eye on the long accumulation rather than the single spectacular move. My compensation structure at the boutique firm was unusual in that a significant portion of it was performance-linked to transaction outcomes, deals we advised on, valuations that led to completed acquisitions, restructuring engagements that closed. In a strong year, that structure meant my total compensation was considerably higher than my base salary suggested. In the 2 years preceding the bellwether decision, I had had 2 very strong years. I had not discussed this with Daniel. I had not discussed it with anyone in his family. My accountant knew. My attorney knew. My financial advisor knew. These were people I had selected precisely because they were competent and discreet and had absolutely no social relationship with any member of the Aldrin family, which was Daniel's family name, which I had taken, which I sometimes thought about in an abstract way when I was doing the math. Daniel knew vaguely that I made decent money. He didn't know how much. We had separate accounts. His idea initially for simplicity, and I had agreed because I had already developed the instinct, barely conscious at the time, that keeping my finances private was a form of protection I might one day need. I paid my share. I contributed to the household. What I didn't do was narrate my balance sheet to a man whose family had decided I was an interesting footnote in their story. There is something clarifying about being underestimated by people with resources. When someone with money looks at you and decides you are not serious, they have told you something useful about the gaps in their attention. Every smart investor will tell you that the best positions are the ones other smart investors have overlooked. The Aldrins had decided I was not worth looking at carefully. That decision cost them nothing in the short term. It cost them considerably more in the long term, not because I set out to punish them, but because I set out to work, and work done without interference, in a market that hasn't been picked over by attentive competition, tends to produce outsized results. And then I started looking at the Bellwether district. You might not know the name. Most people didn't. At the time I started paying attention to it, Bellwether was what urban planners call a transitional neighborhood, not quite declined, not yet revitalized, occupying that specific liminal status where the underlying land value is dramatically higher than the current usage would suggest, where the residents have been there for decades, and the buildings are tired, and the commercial strips have the particular exhausted quality of blocks that have been waiting for something without knowing what they're waiting for. I drove through Bellwether for the first time on a client assignment, a valuation report for a property 3 blocks over. I spent 40 minutes in the district. I did not take notes in the car. I waited until I was back in my office, and then I spent 4 hours building a model. What I saw was this. Bellwether sat between 2 neighborhoods that had already undergone full revitalization cycles. It had original building stock in good structural condition. It had zoning that was broadly permissive compared to the surrounding area. It had 2 transit access points that were scheduled in a city planning document published 18 months earlier that almost nobody had read carefully, to be upgraded within a 5-year infrastructure window. The commercial strips had vacancy rates that looked discouraging until you understood that high vacancy in a transitional district isn't decay, it's availability. It's the market creating an entry window. The model told me what I had already felt driving through. I spent 2 weeks building out the full analysis before I took any action. I ran comparables from 3 previous revitalization cycles in similar cities. I mapped the specific vacancy profiles against absorption rates from analogous transit-adjacent corridors. I built a sensitivity table that stress-tested the timeline assumption in both directions. What the model produced if the transit upgrade ran 2 years late, what it produced if institutional attention arrived 6 months early. And in every scenario, the position was defensible. The floor was solid. The ceiling was higher than anything I had touched professionally. I also hired a structural engineer to walk the blocks with me on a Saturday, posing as my contractor, because I needed an independent read on the building stock's underlying condition before I committed to the thesis that the physical assets were worth acquiring at prices that already required some patience. His report confirmed what my eye had told me. The bones were good, the surfaces were tired, and tired surfaces were the cheapest problem a property could have. Over the following 8 months, I acquired interests in 11 properties across a 4-block zone in Bellwether. I did it through an LLC I established for the purpose, structured cleanly and correctly with proper legal counsel, acquiring in stages in a manner that didn't attract attention because I was buying at prices that reflected the current perceived value rather than the underlying value, which meant the sellers were satisfied, and there was no bidding dynamic that would have flagged me to other investors paying attention to the district. I used a combination of cash reserves I'd been building for 3 years and carefully structured financing. I was methodical. I was patient. I was invisible, which was the one skill my marriage had thoroughly developed in me. During this period, I also bought the country house. It was a genuine impulsive decision, one of very few I have made in my professional life, And I made it because I drove past the property on a Saturday in October when the leaves were doing something extraordinary with the light. And there was a for sale sign at the end of a dirt driveway, and I called the number. It needed work. The kitchen was from a different decade. There was a porch with rotted boards that would need to be rebuilt from the foundation up. The well pump was at the end of its serviceable life. None of this mattered to me. It was mine. It was the first physical place I had ever purchased with my own money for no strategic reason except that I wanted it. I closed on a Tuesday morning. That afternoon, I drove to Renata's house for a Sunday-style family dinner that was happening on a Tuesday because Elaine was visiting and Elaine's schedule arranged everything else around itself. I told them about the house, and they laughed. In the 18 months following that dinner, 4 things happened in sequence, and understanding the sequence matters. The first thing was the infrastructure announcement. The city, in a press release that ran in the business section and nowhere else, confirmed the accelerated timeline for the Bellwether transit upgrades. Instead of 5 years, the project was now on a 3-year build schedule. This mattered because timeline compression of that magnitude changes the investment calculus dramatically. Properties that had been valued on a patient 5-year horizon were now on a timeline that would attract institutional interest within the next 12 to 18 months. The second thing was Marcus and Renata's dinner party. I need to explain the dinner party because it is the moment that transformed what had been a private arithmetic into something else entirely. Marcus had been expanding the family's property management portfolio, which had historically been concentrated in residential. He had been, according to Daniel, looking at commercial opportunities with some intention. At this dinner party, 14 guests, a catered spread, the kind of evening designed to establish something about how one lives, Marcus made a series of pronouncements about real estate development that were delivered with the confidence of a man who is accustomed to being the authority in rooms, and which were also, to my professional ear, almost entirely wrong. He talked about Bellwether. Specifically, he said he'd had his eye on the district, that the timing wasn't right yet, that a man needed to be patient and strategic about these things. He said he'd been looking at a couple of parcels near the transit stops, getting a feel for whether the numbers worked. I was sitting 3 seats away from him at that table. I was eating catered lamb. I said nothing. Renata, refilling wine glasses to his left, looked down the table at me with something I can only describe as generosity. Clara's work is in finance, isn't it? Or was it accounting? She said it the way you would recall that someone used to have a hobby. Impressively, without malice. With the serene authority of someone who is absolutely certain they don't need to retain the details. Investment advisory, I said. Right, she said. How interesting. Marcus was still talking about Bellwether. He was saying he thought the district had maybe 2 more years before the smart money started moving. That if you timed the entry right, you could do well. That the trick was not to get in too early because early entry in transitional markets meant carrying costs that killed your yield curve. Every single property he was describing as future potential, I already owned. Not all of them. Not every parcel in the district, but the 4-block zone I had spent 8 months quietly acquiring, 11 properties, structured through the LLC, currently generating modest revenue from existing commercial tenants, while the infrastructure timeline compressed and the underlying value accrued. That zone included the specific corner he mentioned by name as the kind of anchor position someone smart should be looking at getting. I had bought that corner 14 months ago. I chewed my lamb. I listened to my brother-in-law explain the market to a table that included his sister-in-law who owned it. I thought about the laughter in that living room 18 months earlier, and I thought about the country house where the well pump still needed replacing, and I thought about my mother doing books for 3 businesses in a town with 1 stoplight, and I felt the stone in my chest do something new. It didn't sharpen further, it settled. Like a foundation settling into soil, finding its position, becoming something you could build on. I excused myself to use the restroom. In the hallway outside the bathroom, I sent an email to my attorney and my financial advisor, flagging that I wanted to meet the following week to discuss the formalization of our Bellwether position ahead of what I now assessed as an accelerating institutional interest timeline. Then I went back to the table and listened to Marcus talk for another 40 minutes. The third thing that happened was Daniel. I want to be careful here because I don't think the story I'm telling is a story about a bad man. Daniel was not a bad man. He was a man who had made continuous small choices over years to take the path that cost him least, and those small choices had accumulated into a comprehensive failure of partnership. He was attentive in the ways that were easy. He was absent in the ways that required effort. We had been having a specific recurring conversation for about 2 years. The same conversation cycling through the same positions, never resolving, never escalating to the kind of confrontation that might actually change something. He felt I was withdrawn. I felt unseen. He said the family was just that way. I said that wasn't an explanation. He said I was being sensitive. I said sensitivity wasn't the issue. The conversation we had in March, 6 weeks before everything became visible, was different from the others. He said his mother had mentioned to him that she hoped we were being financially responsible. The country house was charming, she'd said, but it was important not to let sentiment drive financial decisions. She hoped I wasn't overextended. The implication being that my decisions, my money, my assets, were a subject his family was entitled to have opinions about. I looked at my husband across our kitchen table. He had a mug of coffee in his hands. He looked slightly uncomfortable in the way of a man delivering a message he knows is unwelcome but has decided to deliver anyway because the alternative, telling his mother that her opinion is not relevant, is more uncomfortable. Your mother's worried about my financial decisions, I said. Not worried, just you know how she is. I do, I said. What are you hoping I'll say? He looked at his coffee. I just thought you should know. I know, I said. Thank you. He went to work. I sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. Then I called my attorney and moved a timeline forward. The fourth thing was the Bellwether Opportunity Group. This was an investment consortium that had been assembling with increasing urgency over the quarter preceding the formal infrastructure announcement. They were institutional, 2 private equity vehicles and a regional development company. And they were serious, well-capitalized, and approximately 14 months too late to acquire the position they wanted in the district. They had identified the 4-block zone I owned as the central anchor of the development thesis they were building. Without that zone, their project geometry didn't work. My attorney received their first inquiry in early April. It was professional and appropriately structured. They wanted to discuss acquisition of my LLC's holdings. They had clearly done thorough due diligence and knew exactly what they were looking at. They named a number in their inquiry that was, even in a first contact framing that always leaves room to move, remarkable. I read the inquiry on my phone in a parking garage. I sat in my car for about 3 minutes. Then I drove to my attorney's office and we began preparing for a serious negotiation. Let me tell you about the dinner, Elaine's birthday. Every year, a restaurant that required reservations months in advance, that had a prix-fixe menu and a sommelier who remembered everyone's preferences from the previous visit, that was the kind of place where being a regular was itself a form of social positioning. This year it was 18 people. Elaine, Daniel, Marcus, Renata, their children, assorted cousins and family friends, Elaine's older sister who flew in from Phoenix, 2 couples who had been orbiting the family since before Daniel and Marcus were born. I had known about this dinner for 3 months. I had said nothing during those 3 months about the negotiation that was proceeding with the Bellwether Opportunity Group. I had said nothing to Daniel. I had said nothing to anyone in that family. The negotiation was mine. The position was mine. The decision about when and how the information became visible was mine. The timing was not something I planned the way people assume I planned it when they hear the story. The dinner happened to fall 4 days after the transaction closed. The closing had been scheduled around the negotiation's own rhythm, not around the dinner. But when my attorney called me with the final confirmation on a Wednesday afternoon, and I looked at my calendar and saw the dinner circled in red for Sunday, I did make a choice. I decided not to accelerate anything or obscure anything. I decided to let the timeline be what it was. Sunday evening, the restaurant, white tablecloths and candlelight, and the particular ambient sound of a room full of people who feel they are somewhere appropriate. Elaine was in excellent form. She had that quality she sometimes had of genuine warmth, of being actually interested in the people around her, and on her birthday that quality was at its most visible. She asked about Daniel's work. She asked about Marcus's projects. She turned to me at one point and asked, with what seemed like sincere curiosity, how the investment work was going. Unusually well, I said. There was a transaction that closed this week that turned out quite favorably. Oh? She smiled the polite smile. How wonderful. A commercial real estate position, I said, in the Bellwether district. Something shifted at the table. Not dramatically, just a small adjustment in atmospheric pressure. The way a room changes when a word has been said that people are processing. Marcus put down his fork. He looked at me with a new quality of attention, the kind that meant something had registered. Bellwether, he said. What kind of position? A development play, I said. I've been holding a 4-block acquisition zone there for just over 2 years. We closed the sale this week to a consortium that's building out the district around the transit upgrades. The table had gone very quiet. Not the silence of rudeness, the silence of calculation. Marcus said, What kind of zone? I named the cross streets. I watched his face. I need to tell you what I saw there because it matters. It wasn't humiliation exactly. Not at first. It was recognition. The specific, sick recognition of a man who has spent months analyzing a market, delivering confident pronouncements about a market, positioning himself as the authority on that market, and has just understood that the person sitting across the table whom he has never taken seriously has been inside that market the entire time, has owned the position he identified as central, has already transacted it. That's, he started, the anchor block. Yes, I said, you bought the anchor block. I bought the anchor block, I said, and the 3 adjacent blocks. 11 properties total, structured through an LLC I established 3 years ago. The Opportunity Group acquired the full position this week. Renata was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before and couldn't quite name. Daniel was very still. Elaine said quietly, How much? I looked at her. In 7 years of marriage, she had never asked me a direct financial question. She had circled the subject endlessly, had delivered opinions and implications and suggestions through Daniel, had managed to communicate her assessments of my financial decisions without ever engaging with the actual numbers. She was asking now because the context had changed enough that the social performance of disinterest was no longer available to her. I told her, not the full number. The net figure after the debt retirement, the legal and advisory fees, the tax structure implications my accountant had modeled, the clean, realized number, what it had become, what 2 years of patience and precision and invisibility had become. I said it clearly, in the same voice I would use to present a valuation to a client, without apology and without performance. Just the number in the candlelight at Elaine's birthday dinner. The silence afterward was different from the silence before. Marcus excused himself from the table. He was gone for 11 minutes. I counted. When he came back, his face had the particular controlled quality of someone managing an internal weather system. Renata had turned to the cousin on her left and was discussing something, anything, with the determined focus of a woman building a conversational wall. Daniel was looking at me, not with anger, not with the complicated ambivalence I was bracing for, with something rawer than that, something I hadn't seen in a long time. He was looking at me the way he had looked at me in the very beginning, before the family had arranged itself around him and he had led it, before I had become the quiet footnote in a narrative where he was the main character. He was looking at me as if he was seeing something he had spent 7 years not looking at. You did all of this, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I did all of this, I said. While we were... He stopped. While we were married, I said, while I was working, while your family was deciding what I was. He nodded very slowly. He picked up his wine glass. He didn't drink from it. He just held it. Elaine, to her credit, was the first one to recover any composure. She leaned across the table toward me with a very controlled version of her warmth and said, Clara, you should have told us. We would have loved to be involved. I looked at her. That's interesting, I said, because I remember a conversation about 2.5 years ago in which you expressed concern to Daniel that I might be making financially irresponsible decisions. I believe the country house came up. She blinked. Well, we simply wanted to make sure that I wasn't overextended, I said. Yes, I know. Silence. I wasn't overextended, I said. I was positioned. What happened after that dinner did not resolve cleanly. These things never do, and I am suspicious of stories where they do, where the revelation produces instant transformation in the people who had spent years being wrong, where the humiliation of being exposed is somehow converted immediately into genuine reckoning. That is not what happened. What happened was slower and more complicated, and in some ways more instructive. Marcus called me 2 weeks after the dinner, professionally, through a business number he had obtained from somewhere. He wanted to discuss whether there might be collaboration opportunities on a future position. He was careful and courteous. He did not acknowledge the dinner or the prior years or the pattern of dismissal that had preceded the dinner. He spoke to me as a peer, as a market participant whose judgment merited professional engagement, which was both accurate and, under the circumstances, deeply strange to inhabit. I was polite. I thanked him for reaching out. I said I would keep his firm in mind. I did not call him back. Renata sent me a text message that read, "I hope you know none of us ever meant to be dismissive. Families are complicated." Which was not an apology. It was an explanation offered in place of an apology, the kind of statement that asks the recipient to do the emotional labor of forgiveness without the speaker doing the labor of genuine accountability. I read it several times. I thought about what it meant to receive it. Then I did not respond. Elaine came to the house, our house, Daniel's and mine, which was at this point a more complicated geography than it had ever been, about 3 weeks after the dinner. She came on a Tuesday afternoon when she knew Daniel would be at work, which meant she had thought about the timing and chosen it, which meant the visit was intentional in a way that was different from her usual social navigation. She sat in my kitchen. I made tea. She sat with her hands around the mug in a way that was less composed than she usually was, and she said, "I owe you an apology." I sat across from her. "I have spent a long time," she said, "thinking of you as not one of us. And that was wrong." She paused. "It was also stupid, which is in some ways worse." I looked at this woman who had spent 7 years subtly arranging her world so that I remained peripheral to her family's story. I thought about all the dinners and all the sidelong assessments and all the questions addressed to Daniel about my professional opinions, as though he might have better access to them than I did. I thought about the specific category of wrong that is committed not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulated smallness of daily decisions to exclude. "Why are you apologizing now?" I asked. She had the grace to understand the question. "Because now you can't be ignored," she said. "No," I said. "I couldn't be ignored before. You just chose to." She looked at her tea. "Yes," she said. "I suppose that's right." We sat with that for a moment. "Is this going to change?" I asked. Genuinely, I'm not asking for a performance. I'm asking whether you understand what it actually means to not ignore someone. Because it's not about the money. The money is just the thing that made the willful blindness impossible to maintain. But the blindness was always wrong, and I need to know if you're apologizing for the blindness or for getting caught. She was quiet for a long time. "I'm not sure," she said finally. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I respected it more than I would have respected a confident declaration of transformation. Uncertainty about one's own motives is at least truthful. It doesn't repair anything, but it doesn't insult you with a performance of having already been repaired. "I appreciate you coming," I said. "I need you to understand that things have changed, and not just financially. I'm not going to participate in the same dynamic that existed before. I'm not going to be silent when I'm dismissed. I'm not going to attend events where I'm expected to be decorative. If there is a relationship here going forward, it is going to be a different one, or it is not going to be at all." She nodded. She finished her tea. She left. Daniel and I had the real conversation in the last week of May, in the living room of our house at 9 in the evening, with the windows open because it had finally gotten warm, with nothing performative about it. No occasion, no audience, just two people who had been circling the truth of their marriage for longer than either of them had fully admitted. He said he was sorry. He said it the way he said things when he meant them, without the social smoothness that usually accompanied his words, without the practiced warmth. He said, I let them make you feel like you didn't count. And I did it because it was easier than fighting them about it. And I told myself it wasn't that serious and I was wrong and I'm sorry. I listened. I did not tell him it was fine. It wasn't fine. I told him it was true. I told him I believed that he meant it. I told him I didn't know yet whether meaning it was enough, whether the gap between who we had been to each other and who we would need to be was bridgeable, whether I wanted to do the work of bridging it. I told him I needed time to figure out what I wanted, and that figuring out what I wanted was something I was going to do entirely for myself, without orienting it around what was convenient for him or comfortable for his family. And that if he could be patient with that process, I was willing to find out whether there was something worth rebuilding. He said he could be patient. We'll see. The country house is mine either way. I had the porch rebuilt in March, proper cedar boards, done right. The well pump was replaced in February. The kitchen is still from a different decade, but I've decided I like it. There is something about cooking in a kitchen that has obviously been cooked in, that holds the evidence of all its previous use, that I find more honest than a renovated surface that pretends nothing came before it. I drive out there on weekends when I can. The road turns to gravel for the last 2 kilometers, exactly as I told them it did, at Renata's dinner, when they laughed. In the fall, the trees along that gravel road do something extraordinary with the light. I've never fully been able to describe it, and I've stopped trying. Some things are not for describing. Some things are just for having. I want to close with something practical, because I think practical honesty is more useful than a tidy morale. Here is what I know from 2 years of building a position that everyone around me was positioned to dismiss before examining it. Invisibility is a resource. This sounds strange, I know. It sounds like the kind of reframe that asks you to make peace with being wronged. That's not what I mean. I am not at peace with having been dismissed. I am angry about it in a way that is clean and functional and has, if anything, made me better at my work. What I mean is, people who have decided what you are do not watch what you're doing. They are too busy maintaining their decision. And that inattention is a gap through which a great deal of real work can be accomplished quietly over time without interference. I also know this: the moment of visibility, when it comes, is not as satisfying as you might imagine it will be. What I felt at that dinner table was not triumph. It was something more complicated, something that had relief in it and grief in it, and a very clear awareness that the satisfaction of being seen, finally, clearly, was not the thing I had been working for. The work had been for itself. The bellwether position had been correct because it was correct, because the analysis supported it, because I had done the work with rigor and patience and appropriate judgment. That would have been true whether or not Marcus had spent months confidently describing the market I owned to a table that included me. The validation was beside the point. But it did feel good. I'm not going to tell you it didn't feel good. I'm going to tell you it felt good for about 2 hours. And then I went back to work. There is a property 3 miles east of Bellwether. It's not in any plans yet. The transit corridor has a secondary route that nobody has modeled properly. The zoning is complicated enough to deter most casual analysis. But if you spend the time with the municipal documents, and I have spent the time with the municipal documents, the underlying geometry becomes clear. I have been moving quietly for 11 months. Nobody in my husband's family knows. Nobody in my professional network who runs adjacent to that family knows. I am not announcing it at dinners. I am not bringing it up in living rooms with white orchids and cream linen furniture. I am just working, just building, just waiting with the specific patience of someone who has learned that the clock runs, regardless of whether anyone is watching it run, and that when it finishes, what it produces belongs to whoever did the work. The gravel road is mine. The anchor block was mine. The next thing will be mine. And when they laugh, I will smile. I will set down my glass of sparkling water. I will say nothing, and then I will get back to work.